It was formed back in 2004. I personally came involved with Three Rivers back in 2006. Kim, so the time that Three Rivers has been around is about 17 years, a long time. Originally, the thought was that we'd be here just for a very short time and then be done and be over with. Obviously, that's not the case. And Three Rivers mission continues on even beyond the work that we have completed in the RD-784 system that I'll describe for you in a second here. But our mission when we were formed was to accomplish 100 and 200-year urban flood control improvements in South Yuba County. Urban is really where the community, most of the residents live. We weren't trying to solve problems outside that, what we call rural levees, where there's agricultural activities taking place as such. But my organization is responsible for the planning, design, construction, land acquisition, ecological, cultural permitting, financing, but really the whole enchilada, where we go through and start from the very beginning and then build and improve the levee system that protects, in this case, what we're talking about tonight, the mostly the Plumas Lake area in that community. So what we're talking about is really the financing under that we went through early on, and now we're working through to refinance again for those improvements. We are governed by a 5-member board. 2 are the Board of Supervisors. Gary Bradford is one of them. He's our vice president on our board. Then we have 2 board members from the RD-784 system, and then we have 1 board member that's a member at large that participates in all our meetings. Overall, the amount of money that has been spent in construction improvements and then some things that are coming on the immediate horizon for us is approximately this $500 million mark. That's a lot of money. When we first started off on the program, when levee improvements were the glimmer in our eyes, it was only around less than $100 million. You can see what the change has been over the years and what the major improvements have been. That came about for multiple reasons, changes in design criteria, unknown problems coming up that we had to go fix that we did not know about at the time when we started the program. Why don't you go to the next slide? Okay, this slide has a picture on the left, and I'm going to talk about that picture and emphasizing the 5 bullets on the right-hand side. The 5 bullets on the right-hand side of the screen really represent how we talk about our work and what we do on it. Just up in the very top of the screen, you'll see this black line around. That's the city of Marysville. Yuba River is shown on the top as in blue coming down. The Feather River flows from Oroville down, and there you go, south. It flows down all the way down along between Yuba and Sutter County, and then heads off towards the Sacramento area. And then the third river that we do work along is the Bear River. And it also meets into the Feather River down to the left of the cursor there. Our work that we're focusing on today is really aimed at the RD-784 system, that's Reclamation District 784. They're responsible for maintaining the red line that you see there on the screen. That represents about 29 miles of levee that protects the Plumas Lake area and as such. So, and then most recently, we've added that little yellow area on the very top of the screen that we had to add on to the system to provide protection. That's another 2 miles or so. So the entire urban system for the RD area, RD-784, is about 31 miles of levee system. Now, the improvements that we needed to do along the Yuba, Feather, and Bear River, and then that one line that runs from the Bear straight up along Highway 70 is the Western Pacific Interceptor Canal. Our goal when we were formed was to make all these levees to get to what we call the 100 and then 200-year flood standards. The 100-year flood standard relates to amount of water that falls in a given time, measured in history over time as to what an occurrence might be in 1 in 100 years. It's not going to occur only once in 100 years. It could happen multiple times, but it's basically a historical record of what could be an intensity of rain that would fall. That's a FEMA standard. And that standard is what you would go when you build your homes and all that. You're going to measure and get flood insurance from FEMA that to do. And so one of our goals was to achieve that standard and all our levee systems so that we would be able to have our landowners behind the red line, away from the rivers, be protected from floods and have lower insurance rates and be able to develop. Along the way of our construction of our project, the state of California came along and passed another law that only applies to California, and it's the 200-year standard. Again, the same type of thing as the 100-year. It represents an amount of water that would fall in a given period of time. What we ended up doing was adjusting our program, doing levee improvements. And the good news is that as we went through all our program from 2004 to today, that red line that you see on the screen that protects the community is completed. We have achieved both the 100 and 200-year flood control standards. That affects insurance rates, allows development to occur. We've also extended that yellow line that we found late in the system as we built the improvements, that there was a glitch in the overall planning for the state and flood control that we had to go fix. And we added that 2-mile stretch on. That's completed also. So we've been able to complete the work along the Feather, Yuba, Bear, and the Western Pacific Interceptor Canal and have achieved that level of protection. So with that, a lot of good work has been done. Appreciate the work that has occurred. What Seth's going to be talking about is really some of the initial financing that we did on the program, and now how we're refinancing it, and that affects you also. So with that, Seth, I'm going to pass it on to you.
Thank you, Paul, and thank you, Gary, Dan, everybody else that's provided this lead in. We're going to get into the meat of the presentation now. My name is Seth Warzel. I'm a consultant to Three Rivers Levee Improvement Authority, and I help manage their Mello-Roos CFD taxes for them. As a consultant, my job is to prepare the tax rolls on an annual basis and answer any questions regarding the taxes that folks in the area are paying. So I'll start off with why do we have these taxes in place? That was to help finance the levee improvements. The two main sources of funding for the improvements that Paul talked about were grants from the state of California, which all those grants required a local cost share, and local funding that comes from the local community where the improvements are being installed. The local funding was approximately $100 million that was raised through a development impact fee that is charged to all builders that build homes in the urban area in Plumas Lake and in East Linda, as well as the North Arboga study area. So from Olivehurst South and Plumas Lake. That development impact fee was charged as builders build their homes, final maps and pull building permits. In order to generate that money in a timely fashion, we did this financing, the Mello-Roos CFD. In addition to that financing, the county and the water agency stepped in approximately 2008-2009 timeframe with the downturn in the economy to provide the additional money needed to continue to complete the levee improvement program. And so the county and the water agency issued general obligation bonds to generate about $47 million. The balance came from the impact fees and this Mello-Roos district. The CFDs were created because in order to continue the levee improvements before development was completed, we needed to advance fund those future fees. To do that, we formed Mello-Roos districts, and that's a common way that new development finances infrastructure in California. If you need the money up front to build the facilities, you can issue bonds that are secured by taxes that are paid in the future from future homes that are built that receive the benefit of that infrastructure improvement. In this case, we financed levee improvements. In 2007, we had a funding agreement with our development community that in order for them to help finance that, their upfront fees, they would form a Mello-Roos district, and they could decide how much of those fees they wanted to finance. Every developer had their option to finance within some constraints a certain amount of development fees that they felt like they could pass on to homeowners and still be marketable. Different developers chose different amounts to finance. Each developer was placed into a zone within the Mello-Roos districts that we formed with the tax rates that were set based on the amount of fees that they financed. The developers provided their funding upfront, and in exchange for providing that funding upfront and placing the taxes on their homes, Trilla issued what's called builder bonds. The purchase of those builder bonds by those developers was why we coined the term builder bonds. Again, the proceeds from those builder bonds were used by Trilla to complete the levee improvements, and that funding has been available to us since we issued those bonds back in 2007. Under the Mello-Roos district, the way the tax rates work, and I'll get more into this in later slides, we levy taxes at their maximum rates while those builder bonds are outstanding. While the developer owns the bonds, the homes that they sell to homeowners, those homeowners will pay their taxes at their maximum rates in order to provide enough funding to redeem those builder bonds in the future. The builder bonds were unique in that they don't pay any semi-annual interest and principal. They start at a low value, they're purchased at a discount, and when they mature at their face value. They mature 30 years later at a higher amount, like in a single balloon payment. So we levy the taxes at the maximum rates to build up cash and to build up, to pay off remaining impact fees for each developer in order to ultimately redeem those bonds in the future. This has caused the issue that we have today where the taxes have been levied at excessively high rates. In order to address that problem, the county and the water agency and Three Rivers worked together to execute an agreement called the Plumas Lake Workout Agreement. They executed that agreement last year in July, and the agreement effectively tasked the agencies to work together to achieve the goals of reducing the levy impact fee amounts that are burdening development in Plumas Lake so that more homes can be developed, to eliminate or refund or reduce the builder bond obligations, and to ultimately, in exchange, reduce the CFD tax amounts that are paid by homeowners in Plumas Lake today and future homeowners that will be required to pay taxes in the future. As part of that workout agreement, the goal was to issue new bonds to redeem the outstanding builder bonds, essentially relieve debt, and ultimately reduce the amount of taxes that were levied on homes. In exchange, they also agreed, the water agency agreed to write off a certain amount of debt in order to reduce the impact fees that are paid. Because the levee improvements are complete, as impact fees are paid today, those are used to service the debt that was issued by the county and the water agency. Ultimately, on August 31st, we closed on a bond issuance where we redeemed approximately $55.85 million of builder bonds for a total of $39.55 million. Ultimately, what ended up happening is that developers received less than what their bonds were worth. They took a write-off on their bonds. That difference of about $16.3 million represents a reduction in the total amount of debt that will be repaid in the future from property owners' taxes. The builder bonds interest rates was approximately 7.68%, and the new bonds have an interest cost of about 3.3%, a reduction of more than half of about 4.37%. So this represents savings to not only the property owners in Plumas Lake, but also a savings in the total amount of debt that's going to be repaid. As a result of the refunding of the builder bonds, this triggers a change in how we administer the tax. In prior years, while builder bonds were outstanding, the annual costs of the district to be repaid equaled the maximum amount of special taxes that were to be paid from homes that are occupied. We call them occupied parcels. These are homes that have been built and sold to homeowners in Plumas Lake. With conventional debt outstanding now, with these redemption bonds that we've issued and we've retired the builder bonds, the annual cost is now equal to the debt service that's due each year, plus an amount for administration and a small provision for delinquencies. The parcels that are now subject to the tax in prior years, while builder bonds were outstanding, were only those occupied parcels. Because the builders owned the undeveloped land in that tax zone, the way the CFD was structured is we don't levy taxes on the same entities that own the builder bonds. They would essentially be taking money out of one pocket, paying the tax and putting it right back in their own pocket since they owned the bonds. Now that the bonds have been redeemed, those builders no longer own those bonds. With conventional debt, they're obligated to pay taxes on their undeveloped land. So with conventional debt outstanding, we determine parcels in all of the following categories. We look at occupied parcels. We look at final map parcels. Those are parcels where a subdivision map has been recorded and builders are building homes. And then we also look at large lot parcels, the remainder of the subdivisions that have yet to be final mapped. When we determine how we levy the tax, we call it a waterfall. We start with occupied parcels. We look at how much tax can we get at their maximum rates from occupied parcels, compare that to the annual cost of the district. If there's not enough tax from occupied parcels, then we look at how much more is needed to be levied from final map parcels. If that's not sufficient, then we look to the large lot parcels and levy up to the total of the annual costs. So we have this pecking order of taxes. That will become important as we talk about how the rates may go down in the future. So in general, as tax rates will be reduced over time as development continues. So as we grow that first tranche in the waterfall of occupied parcels, the more taxes that we can levy from occupied parcels that are greater than the amount of annual costs, then the annual tax levy will be proportionally reduced over time. The timing and the amount of the tax rate reductions will vary between tax zones because it's a function of how quickly occupied parcels are created, how fast the developer will continue to final maps, build homes, and sell them to homeowners. So generally, the more fully developed a project is, the greater that first tranche in our tax rate pecking order group is, and that allows us to reduce the tax that's levied on all of those occupied parcels, and the sooner it's achieved. So when we formed the Mello-Roos districts in 2007, as Paul talked about, we were building the levee improvements at that time. The amount of money needed to build the levee improvements was growing over time. And so we developed this agreement between all the development partners in the Plumas Lake area to advance fund their fees. As I mentioned earlier, each of those developers could determine how much they wanted to finance of their fees that they had due, and adjust their taxes accordingly. In some cases, some developers and some subdivisions in Plumas Lake just paid their levy fee obligation in cash. Some decided to finance a small amount of it with the Mello-Roos district, and some decided to finance more. Ultimately, that decision affects the ultimate tax rates in each of the zones in the CFDs. This first map shows we have two Mello-Roos districts. First one is 2006-1. This map shows all of the lots that are in CFD 2006-1. Each color represents a different tax zone, so it's essentially a different subdivision. The orange represents the KB Homes Plumas Lake Cobblestone development. The yellow represents the Riverside Meadows subdivision that's being developed by Legacy Home. The orangish yellow represents the River Oaks East and North subdivisions being developed by Lennar, and so forth. Many of those subdivisions were under development at the time in 2006 when we formed the Mello-Roos districts. If parcels were developed and already sold to homeowners, they were excluded from the tax. In order to form the Mello-Roos districts in 2006, we needed a waiver of all of the property owners in order to form the district. If the developer had already sold a parcel, then then that parcel was excluded because we wouldn't have been able to get that waiver in order to create the Mello-Roos district and finance the levy improvements. So there are situations in this Mello-Roos district where you will see some homes that are right next to another. For example, on this street here, one neighbor may not have this tax and the other neighbor will. And it's purely a function of when that home was sold to that homeowner. If it was sold after April of 2007, when we formed the district, then it was included in the Mello-Roos district. If it was sold prior, then it's not included. This is evident also in another KB Homes development, Hawes Ranch. You can see here where only a portion of the development is included in the CFD. And it's purely a function of when that Mello-Roos district was formed. We have a second Mello-Roos district, CFD 2006-2. There's really some legal nuances as to why we formed two Mello-Roos districts, but they ostensibly work the same. This had to do with the timing of when funding was provided by developers in 2007, which isn't as very relevant today. So these are the zones that are in CFD 2006-2. One of the Rio del Oro Village 16 and Rio del Oro 14, as well as Draper Ranch North. This particular development is in both CFDs because at the time they had funded some prior money and again, it was a timing of when funding was provided by the developers. And then we have this subdivision here, Feather Glen, which is partially developed today. So I'm going to go through for each CFD tax zone some statistics and some projections on where we think rates might go. What I'm reporting here are average special tax rates. As a development moves forward, when they final a new map, we set the tax rate at that time. So each time a developer finals a new map, we'll be doing an analysis of what the tax rate can be. There are some constraints in the CFD that restrict the amount of the tax levy that can be levied on homes in a final map. So each time a developer finals a new map, we do an analysis of against those constraints, and that sets a new tax rate. What we're reporting here are the average tax rates. So in CFD 2006-1, I'll go through zone 1 only because it's the first zone in a little bit more detail and explain what we're showing on each of these few slides. For CFD 2006-1, the average special tax rate last fiscal year 2021, was $1,154.34. We levied that tax rate. That was the tax. That's the average tax of all the maximum tax rates on 35 occupied parcels at the time. For fiscal year 21-22, we're levying a tax on 103 parcels. So they're currently actively developing and moving through that project right now. And so the additional 68 parcels that we're levying taxes on, the additional 68 parcels that we're levying the taxes on have different rates. So the average rate actually, it went down a little bit because some of the newer parcels have a lower tax rate. And so the average actually pulled it down, but we're still levying the tax at its maximum rate for all of these parcels. In order to actually see a real reduction from the maximum rate, we need an additional 97 units. So we need to get to 200 units in the subdivision before that pool in the first tier of our tax levy, the occupied parcels, the maximum rate is greater than the annual cost of the debt service that'll be levied, that is levied to service debt on the refunding bonds. So this chart shows the maximum tax rates for the average maximum tax rates across all of the parcels in the development. The bars represent the maximum tax rate that on occupied parcels over time. So this would be the rate that we would levy if we did not do this refunding. The green line represents the number of final map units that in fiscal year 2021, the actual amount, and in fiscal year 21-22, the actual amount that we're levying the tax on. We're projecting based on the developer's absorption projections for their project, what the amount of occupied units will be in each of the forthcoming years through fiscal year 30-31, or essentially through build out of all the subdivision under the developer's projections. When we get to that 200 unit threshold, so you can see that would take place between fiscal year 22-23 and 23-24, that's when we would start to see a reduction in the tax rate that will be levied on occupied parcels. So here we have $1,152 was the tax rate that is levied on occupied parcels, the 103 for this forthcoming fiscal year. In fiscal year 22-23, the tax rate would continue to rise because the tax rate escalates at 2% per year. But once we cross that threshold of 200 units, then we would start to see the tax go down relative to its maximum rate. And this shows a projection of what that reduction might look like over time. So this achieves the goal that the workout agreement was looking for, was reduction on tax rates in the future on homeowners, existing homeowners, and future homeowners. So this shows the rates for tax zone 1. We have a similar analysis for tax zone 3 here. This is the KB Homes, Plymouth Rate Cobblestone, and Hawes Ranch. Now these are two subdivisions that are a bit of away from each other in Plymouth Lake and North Orbogo study area, but we formed zones based on the developer at the time. And in this case, it was KB Homes. They owned both of those projects and were developing them. So fiscal year 2021, the average special tax rate is $913, and that's being levied on 314 units. The 21-22 tax rate that we're levying is $931.52. And that is levied on 8 different maps, 8 different tax rates. That's the average rate across 8 different tax rates. And that escalation is due solely to the 2% escalation in tax rate across those 314 units. The current development plans in Cobblestone, the developer KB is working to final new maps. They're not actively selling, they were not actively selling prior to us setting the 21-22 tax rates. We expect that they will be doing that soon. In order to have a real tax reduction rate, real tax levy reduction across the maximum rate, we need an additional 179 units. That development needs to get to 493 units in order to have that first pool of occupied parcels have tax rates that would exceed the debt service due on the outstanding debt now. So here you can see we project that to take place in 24-25. The developer, again, is working to final maps. We don't expect that they would have the 493 units until fiscal year 24-25, but they are actively developing. The sooner that they can get to that 493 mark, then we would start to see some tax rate reductions in the Cobblestone and Hawes Ranch area. So for CFD 2006-1, tax zone 4, the River Oaks East and North subdivisions that Lennar is developing, the average special tax rate across all the tax rates there, and there are currently 2 tax rates that were levied in fiscal year 2021. The average rate was $993.61 on 119 parcels. The rate that we would expect to see, or that we will see in 21-22, is about $950, and they're actively developing and selling homes out there. So you're seeing that tax rate increase. The new occupied units, this difference, the 96 additional units, are at a lower tax rate, $870.06, as compared to the 119 that were paying taxes on the prior year. So you're seeing this tax rate go down. That's purely as a result of new parcels coming in that are at a lower tax rate. In order to see a reduction against the maximum rate, we need to get to 313 parcels, an additional 98. And the developer is actively building. We expect this to take place in fiscal year 22-23. That's when we would see this blue line start to cross down below the maximum rates and away from the maximum rates. The maximum rates are going down because the newer homes that are being built are being assigned lower tax rates within the constraints of our analysis. So you're seeing the blue bars go down, but once we get to that 313 parcels, then we'll see a levy that's below the maximum rates. So in 2006-1, tax zone 7, this is the Riverside Meadows, which is currently being developed by Legacy Homes. They had average special tax rates across 633 units of about $1,655. And that was based on homes being levied at 2 different rates. So we're averaging the weighted average of 2 different rates there. Fiscal year 21-22, we saw an additional 11 parcels developed, and the average special tax rate across the 74 units that we're levying a tax in this coming fiscal year is $1,695.42. And that rises primarily as a result of the 2% escalator on those parcels. In order to see a real tax rate reduction, we need an additional 84 parcels, a total of 158. So here we expect that to take place next fiscal year when we're levying the tax in 22-23, and we'll see that's a rather large subdivision. So as that subdivision builds out, we'll see even greater tax rate reductions over time because we have a much larger pool of occupied parcels when we get to 550 units at build out to reduce that tax rate even further down. So moving on to the Draper Ranch subdivision that's currently being developed by Generation Communities. It's a local builder made up of, managed by three members of the gentleman listed here. The tax rates that were levied in 2021 were at $1,950.74 on 74 parcels. They're slowly getting started to develop, and they have an additional 4 units that were developed for fiscal year 21-22. That brought the tax rate to $1,989.76. There's one tax rate in this tax zone right now, and so the increase on the average rate is purely as a result of the 2% escalator. In order to see a real tax rate reduction, we need an additional 86 units to get to 164 of total occupied parcels to see a real tax rate reduction. We expect that to take place in fiscal year 22-23. And that's, again, another rather large subdivision. And so once they get to 545 units at build out, we'll see a tax rate reduced down to about $545 a year. But that will take a bit of time. It'll be, up until fiscal year 29-23 to get those continued reductions. What we're reporting here, though, by the way, is combination of the taxes in tax zone 5 and tax zone 3. We're essentially looking at those 2 tax levies. They show up as 2 line items on the tax bill. We're looking at those together. So this is the combined rate for those 2 line items on the tax bill. Oops, the wrong button there. Okay, so moving on to the Feather Glen subdivision, CFD 2006-2, tax zone 2. We have 1 tax rate on the developed parcels in this subdivision. We were levying the tax on 101 parcels. This subdivision is broken into 4 phases. Phases 1A, 1B have been developed for quite some time. The rest of the subdivision is waiting for the developer to continue to move forward. But the tax rates in fiscal year 2021 last year were $1,223 on 101 parcels. They finished out that subdivision last year. The first 2 phases, 112 units were levied taxes of $1,248. We need an additional 46 units in order to see a real tax rate reduction, and that will need to come from 2 new final maps. And so, given the developer's projections, we don't expect that to take place for a couple of years. So unfortunately, this subdivision will see tax rate increases of 2% per year until the next final map is recorded and the subdivision restarts selling homes, and we see an increase in home sales. We project that to take place in 23-24 or 24-25. And then once they sell enough of those homes, then in 25-26, we would see that real tax rate reduction. And once they get to their 214 units, we expect that to take place fairly quickly. And then because they only have another 12 or 13 units to build. Once they complete that, then you'll see this tax continue with its 2% tax rate escalation over time. The last two zones, which I'll go over, are fully developed zones. So tax zone 5 in CFD 2006-2 is already fully developed. As part of the workout, we reanalyzed the tax rates, and we constrained the amount of debt that could be issued and refunded on that project, and that resulted in a real tax rate reduction right away. So we had 79 units that we levied parcels on in fiscal year 2021. The tax rate that was being levied at that time was over $2,600. Because of that excessive tax rate, we limited the amount of debt that could be issued. And so this is where a significant amount of debt was relieved by the builder bond owner. The resulting debt service that is required to be paid in fiscal year 21-22 is fully satisfied already by the 80 occupied units. We had one additional unit that we're levying taxes on this year. We see that real tax rate reduction show up immediately. So in fiscal year 21-22, we're getting an immediate tax rate reduction because we've constrained the amount of debt and associated debt service right away. And so these parcels will see a tax rate reduction this year, all 80 units, and their tax will continue to escalate at 2% per year from this reduced rate. A similar situation in CFD 2006-2, zone 6, Rio de Oro Village 16. It's fully developed. There were 68 units that we levied a tax on in fiscal year 2021, at taxes of $1,228.92. The additional 4 units were levied a tax at the reduced tax rate for a fully developed a subdivision. And again, we constrained the amount of debt and the associated debt service on that subdivision. And so those units are seeing a real tax rate reduction right away. So they'll see actually, I think there are still a few more units that we expect to be built out in future years, and that'll provide a slight reduction as we have an additional 2 units come on next fiscal year. But they see an immediate tax rate reduction because the debt service and the annual costs can be completely covered by the amount of occupied units that are being levied a tax in fiscal year 21-22. So we see an immediate tax rate reduction. So I've walked through all of the tax zones where we're levying taxes in the CFDs. These are the only parcels that we're seeing taxes associated with the Trillis CFDs. No other parcels that are shown on this map pay the Trillis CFD tax. Only these 2 CFDs and the zones within them. So that concludes my presentation. I'll turn it over to Kim. She can help facilitate any questions as they come up. I'm happy to answer them and stay on as long as it takes to get folks' questions answered.
Thanks so much, Seth. I also want to point out that we will be posting this presentation to Trilla's website, and I believe Gary Bradford will also be sharing it, and Dan Mearswa will post it to the county's website so that you can look at it again. This contact information will also be available. With that, do I have any questions? You can use your mouse to scroll over your name in the participant list and raise your hand, or you can share a question in the chat. Any questions?
I would just add that this phone number that's posted here on the screen is a voicemail line. I work very hard to be prompt and return calls within 24 hours. So that will, if you just leave a message with your assessor's parcel number, this way I can do the research and be more educated when I give you a call back, and be more efficient. Or if you want to email me at the email address shown, and it'll be available on Trilla's website. This same number shows up on the property tax bills as well. So if you have any questions, again, I work very hard to respond to them. And again, the voicemail service seems to work well because I can do a little bit of research and be more efficient when I give you a call back.